Hi, and welcome to my talk about queer identities through the camera lens. This talk will focus on LGBTQ plus film history. Although it's not as detailed as I would like, given the time frame, I will try and put in as much evidence as I can and try and make it as passionate as I can. This is something that I adore learning about. Looking at representation in film is what helped me find my own identity. So if you didn't know, I'm TJ, and I use he, him pronouns. Just a quick content warning as well, there will be references to suicide and death, homophobia and transphobia. So if you are uncomfortable with any of those elements, please feel free to skip. Um, this talk also won't take a linear sort of perspective. Progress in terms of representation in film has not been linear. It has jumped and reversed and jumped again. So, if you will, picture the context as well. We also need to remember the implications of the Hays Code, the Stonewall riots, as well as the AIDS crisis, and what sort of effect that would have on film and how film affects societal views on queer people. So without further ado, if we are to look at film, we have to start somewhere. So let's start early stages. Most of society still likes to think that, the LGBTQ plus forum, the LGBTQ plus, community just sort of appeared at the start of the internet, start the first brick thrown. When really, we have been around for centuries. We have been around as long as the human race has been around, if not longer. And so has representation in film. If we were to look at it, 1894 features one of the first depictions of homosexuality on camera. This is two men in the Dixon experimental sound film dancing together. Just a year later would be the same year that Oscar Wilde gets found guilty for being homosexual. So we have been around. This is obviously pre-Hays Code, and if you don't know what the Hays Code is, the Hays Code was basically set up by a bunch of strong conservatives with strong, small-minded conservative views, and it limited expression and representation across the board, so including gender roles, sexuality, even people of colour. You weren't allowed an interracial kiss or relationship or friendship sometimes on screen. So obviously the Hays Code plays a big role in this. But before the Hays Code came into place in the 1930s and, revised again in 1934, we did have representation. In Wings, 1927, we have a passionate kiss between two comrades as one of them is wounded. And in 1930, Morocco, we have Marlene Dietrich, this woman who comes out in a suit, in a tuxedo, sings a male sort of song, if you will, and then goes into the audience and kisses another woman. That scene is just astonishing. To think that that could happen and be allowed to happen, audience must have been shocked. Of course, the story then goes on to focus on her relationship with her male counterpart, but still, that's huge. But then the Hays Code comes in, and what we see is queer representation being linked to villains. So we have people who aren't outwardly allowed to be queer or say they're queer, but are presented as the villains, as the morally wrong ones. For example, in Rebecca, 1940, a film based on the novel by Daphne du Maurier, Mrs. Danvers is coded as queer. She is coded as having this unnatural desire for the deceased Rebecca. And ultimately, she faces her demise by burning in fire. Similar to this, the villains in Rope, 1948. Although they can't explicitly say they're gay, they have a very intimate conversation about murder. You can only guess where that ends up. But if we were to skip forward into the 80s, this is after the fall of the Hays Code. We have Cruising, Al Pacino, an undercover cop who is trying to track down this murderer who's killing homosexuals. The depictions of murder and the depictions of the scenes are just disgusting. This is sometime after the fall of the Hays Code, and yet, because it was at a huge point in the AIDS crisis, you've got this further growing fear of queer people because they've got the disease. So of course, with films like this coming out, you have a rise again in further homophobia. People being afraid that they'll catch the gay disease. It's a lack of knowledge, but fueled by bigotry and small-mindedness. But this Hays Code does, again, have lasting implications, as we've seen with Cruising. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention queer coding evil Ursula. You cannot tell me that Ursula from The Little Mermaid was not queer coded. She was inspired by the drag artist Divine. I'll leave that to your imagination. If we jump forward again, we've got Morally Wrong and implications of the Hays Code. So we have the Children's Hour. The Children's Hour, which is originally based off a play, which tried to get a film, but it was heteronormative, to say the least. In the 1961 adaptation, with Shirley MacLaine and Audrey Hepburn, they play two teachers accused of being in a lesbian relationship. And so the downfall of that is when Shirley MacLaine's character realizes that she is in fact a lesbian, the only way out she can see is to commit suicide. Although the scene isn't shown directly on film, you do see the shadow and the reaction of Audrey Hepburn's character. The impact on the audience is going to be that, so being queer is morally wrong. And if you don't want to end up like that, you can't be this, as if it was a choice, you know? And the reality of it is shown further in the 1990s film Boys Don't Cry, based on the real life of Brandon Teena, a trans man in the US. It ends with Brandon being raped and killed because of who he is. And there was no other way out for him. And it's the reality of it, because films are depicting reality, and reality is influenced by films and the media. It is sad, and it is true. But taking a little bit of a different note, there is some positives. And so with the fall of the Hays Code and the growth of media, what we see is individual companies and writers and producers away from the sort of group work of early cinema, as some of the big, conglomerates and production companies. You can create much more varied representation and target it to directly the queer audience. So we've got The Boys in the Band, 1970. Fantastic film based on the play, and it shows a different sort of side to it, similar to Desert Heart. You know, these have beautiful stories, and yes, although they may feature some homophobia, because to live as yourself, especially in the 70s and 80s, you're gonna face homophobia. Heck, you even face it now. You know, we're in 2021. But like I was saying, indie productions and varied representations, especially with the growth of documentary films. We have the beautiful Paris is Burning, a documentary film about the primarily black cultural, trans and queer ball scene in the US. It is fantastic. It is beautiful, and yet it leaves the question, if this was to be produced by a big company who's going to sell it to a mass audience, would it be as diverse? Would it be as filled with representation? Well, no. No, it wouldn't. Because they are trying to target a wider audience, forgetting, of course, that, hello, the queers are integrated with the wider audience. We're not hiding in a cupboard somewhere. We are here. We are alive, and we deserve to see positive representation. Because before this, any sort of representation, it seems, was primarily white and made to be villainous and evil and morally wrong. So obviously, the best thing we see is the growth of intimacy and truly beautiful queer relationships and queer identities. If you are to look at Brokeback Mountain as a staple piece of this, look at how far we are now. This came out 15 years ago, over 15 years ago, 2005. And now we have these beautiful films such as Moonlight and the recent documentary Disclosure and Carol, 2015. And all of this together accumulates into the history of queer representation in film as a journey from the shadows, a journey from being the background character to being, the villain, to being center stage in our own story, by being proud in our own story. Obviously, there is still a way to go, and thank goodness TV helps when it can. And I do realize our history has not always been colourful and bright, but with reflecting on our film history and our representation of film history, we can be proud of where we are now. We can look back and we can subvert it into saying, actually, you thought we were the villain? No, we were the power all along. So thank you very much for listening. I apologize if I rambled a bit and my words weren't clear, but if you have any questions, please feel free to get in contact. Yeah, thank you very much.